As I told last time, we decided to end these programs by having a dozen or so world leaders spend a whole weekend discussing the problems we had raised. Our thought was to invite people who had themselves shouldered great responsibility, mostly in politics, and who could talk about it. They came to our farm in southern Vermont, a farm where nothing grows but trees, and where we've gone for our summers for 30 years. It is deep in the hills, not only secluded, but very hard to find. This, by the way, is the day for others to talk. I'm going to try to be silent, maybe unnaturally so.
See how small the windows are, and there even are a few of the original glass panes, I think, blown glass.
Original meaning?
Oh, well, I guess from the house. It's about 200 years ago.
My wife, Catherine, Kitty, tells two early arrivals about the old house. Ralph Derendorf, former commissioner responsible for research, science, and education of the EEC, and now head of the London School of Economics. Hans Selye, Canadian scientist. Most of the others eventually found the house. The county sheriff helped. Former British Prime Minister Edward Heath. I first met him years ago when he was lecturing at Harvard.
More fitted to their occupants. Humble, simple types. Isn't it wonderful up here? Well, absolutely adorable. Welcome. Thank you very much. You slept well? Very, very well.
Caught up on. Are you subject to jet lag or?
Not all that much, because I try to arrange it sensibly coming across, and I get some sleep coming over. Don't drink a lot of alcohol and eat very little. Nice. And I find it's much easier to adjust.
I do all those things and I still can't adjust. My psyche is still right. Shirley Williams, British cabinet minister. Shirley Williams was a guest staying at the house. The next car brought a guest we very much needed for the discussion, Georgy Arbatov, also a friend. He is a member of the Soviet Parliament, member of the Soviet Academy, and a senior advisor to Mr. Brezhnev on American affairs.
Good morning.
You have a nice footwear on?
Yes, I have it.
You slept well?
Yes, everything is okay.
A very great personal friend, Kukrit Pramaj, a journalist and very recently Prime Minister of Thailand. The historian Arthur Schlesinger, a fellow veteran of the Kennedy administration, and his wife Alexander Schlesinger. Better, but we're going to have this.
Are we the last?
As one would expect. No, the Winships have yet to come.
Winships, they left before we did. You better say not a search
They
party.
lost on
Well, very often it's people that get lost and never arrive.
Maybe they're coming on horseback.
Come on, they
They did leave about 2.
Oh, well, they left about the same time we did. And then he...
Maybe he was looking at a horse and buggy on the way or something.
Tom Winship, the editor of the Boston Globe. He lives in Vermont and naturally thought he could find the way without help. He did turn up eventually.
Are you just over for the weekend?
No, I was over for a Ford Foundation meeting. I'm a trustee of the foundation. We had one of our meetings. It's been quiet for the last 2 years. I don't know what it's going to be like next year because...
Conversation began informally in two groups. Other guests joined, whom we will meet later. The cameras moved from one group to the other, and as often in discussion, you will hear first not a connected interchange, but a series of points, statements of faith. Ralph Dahrendorf begins.
I would assume that economic performance and individual income in Britain will continue to be significantly lower than economic performance and individual income in Germany. And I would assume that there are a few intermediate stages that perhaps one or two countries will move from one level to the other, but there are going to be different levels. And I really believe, that these different levels are bearable if they are compensating social factors. And I would almost assume, sounds a terrible thing to say for a German who lives in Britain, that the British version of somewhat lower economic performance and individual income, but higher social equilibrium, as you called it, may well be preferable.
What Ted was saying, what Jack was saying, and that is that, and I think what we are looking at really in the Western world is the gradual constraining and finally narrowing down of competition to the point where we can't talk anymore about living with competitive markets because we haven't got them. And that leads me to the next point that I want to make, which is if the instruments that determine competition don't operate anymore because of the power of companies and the power in some respects of trade unions, so that you're looking at a different structure of society that we used to have, then I want to make the point, what does this do also to the structure of democracy? Because I think it probably does something very profound to it. Well, anyway, I think we're seeing something which, as it were, lies beyond what even Karl Marx could have seen, because he wrote a long time ago and he showed great perception. But that what's emerging is that the role of government, the role of the public sector is now so substantial, especially in countries like France, Italy, United Kingdom and so forth, that what we're not looking at any longer is the classical capitalist economy. We're looking at what people sometimes call a mixed economy, and I think the mixed economy will throw up something.
We call it state monopoly capitalism.
No, you don't, because it wouldn't be right.
We do.
No, but you're quite wrong about that, because it doesn't involve state monopolies in a lot of cases.
We will change, for sure. We don't consider our society as having achieved the ideal state of affairs. We call it, well, the transitional period to communism, and there will be a lot of changes in coming decades. But the changes will go in different directions, I am afraid, in your countries and in ours. And
now, if you spoke to millions of Russians, I believe that given the chance, they would say, oh, we'd far rather have consumer goods and try and reach the stage which American capitalism has reached, rather than go on putting more and more of our resources into military power, which is what is happening at the moment in the Soviet Union.
I would say that if you ask the Soviet citizen what he would prefer more, he would the first mention not to have war, which is very understandable for a country which has lost 20 million people. And they would say even, we are ready not to have so many consumer goods, but please have peace.
I think we've reached a position where we've got to revalue the situation, say, as between the college professor and the longshoreman or the miner, partly because there's a hell of a lot of compensation built into the professional job with respect to the professor. I mean, he does have security, he does have better pension opportunities, better holidays and so on. And we've got to allow the working man, the manual worker, to catch up with a lot of these security elements.
That, it's very pleasing for a Marxist heart to listen to different sort of representatives of capitalist society out discussing their problems, which actually we have mainly solved. And I think, well, unemployment and inflation, and for me, for my colleagues, it would be a new demonstration of the eternal truth found in Marx about this major contradiction between socialization of the production and private ownership.
It's my view that half the problem in Northern Ireland is the lack of jobs. It's the difference overwork that creates the tension. 40,000 jobs into Northern Ireland could probably bring peace tomorrow, because when young people are without a job, you know, they begin to talk and take an interest in anything. And if there's some apparently great dedicated cause, they will take part in that, even if it means throwing bombs. And that's the awful tragedy of an area like Northern Ireland, that this has developed mainly because of lack of job opportunity. So let's run away from that responsibility.
No.
I don't know that it's more harmful or distressful to be afraid of pollution or of atomic war or of the crash of the stock exchange than it is to be afraid of being eaten up by a bear. And since we have no way of making actual comparisons between the medical implications of the two types of threat, I think it's anybody's guess. It's my personal guess, but this I have no proof for, except an empirical one. It seems to me that that's how everything has always worked. Man has an innate tendency to go up to the maximum of his stress tolerance. You know, like a racehorse just likes to run, and it likes to run as fast as it can. And it will meet the stresses and strains of whatever is a stress and strain in his particular situation.
I agree with Darendorf. I think that what industrial society has done has been to undermine the traditional and spontaneous, natural, organic forms of cohesion. And as these have been undermined, nothing has arisen to take its place. Therefore, you get these kind of tribalistic or quasi-religious movements like fascism and communism, which try to produce an artificial cohesion through main force.
I really feel that we must have reached the end of the period in which industrial development and everything that goes with it is sort of a purpose in itself. And it seems to me that all the developed societies will only survive if they recognize that there's more to life than industrial growth, the growth of cities, the development of cities, the creation of more and more of the same thing. And it is indeed my view that many countries, incidentally, so-called capitalists as well as so-called socialists, and indeed the so-called socialists more than the capitalists, have made the same mistake. And that is the mistake to believe that the world of work, the world of living around work, is one which is bound to be messy and unpleasant and in many ways inhuman. And in many ways we've made the mistake of believing that all we have to do is try to get out of it. That the great thing to achieve is for the working man to have more spare time. And the great thing to achieve is for the city dweller to go out to the country and have a chance to go out to the country. And that, I believe, is wrong. That is, when I talk about improvement and about trying to improve society, what I really mean is an improvement of the work situation.
Both groups began the active discussion, the interchange, on work and the ethics of work. Arthur Schlesinger thought the attitudes toward work were changing.
Most fundamentally, I suppose we changed from a nation which was shaped by Calvinism, where the Puritan ethic predominated. An ethic of discipline, work, responsibility, into a nation which, for various reasons, has become essentially or predominantly hedonistic, where self-gratification becomes much more important.
This Calvinism point, I think, is fascinating, because what has actually happened is that in the early phases of capitalist industrial development, it was actually necessary to save and to have this pattern of deferring gratification, of saving today in order to have greater possibilities tomorrow for the individual, and of amassing capital, investing it, having growth, and so on and so forth. And you could argue, you know, that a developed capitalist society can survive only if it abandons Calvinism and adopts hedonism. In other words, in order to solve the same problem of keeping industry going, of keeping industrial production going, you need a different approach, you need a different set of values.
I have a deep personal conviction in this. I was born and brought up on a Canadian farm, and I've regarded my whole life as being an escape from manual labor. And so I would hate to think that I had at any juncture been under some obligation to return to the tedium that I have
admittedly and barefacedly tried to escape
your
from.
personality, you see. You did actually have that
that's a bit
experience.
different, Professor. You know, if you want to go to university, you haven't passed the exams. Then you go to work, but you have this hope. You work for 2 or 3 years. Then you have 1 year preparatory courses, and then you can go.
What Kenneth is saying is that from his point of view, at any rate, if you're working on a shop floor on a production line, it's a very dull, boring business, and it's got no ennobling effect. Now, surely this goes to the root of our industrial society today. If it is a dull, boring business, and I don't really think it requires very much imagination from the outside to see that that is so, then what, in fact, you do about it? Because to be doing that for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, year after year, and know it's going on for the rest of your life, and that in all probability you'll have reached the top of the acknowledged wage scale, probably by the time you're, what, 25, 28, something like that?
Oh, earlier.
Earlier.
You could
And therefore,
18 even.
for the rest of your life, you're on that spot, in that groove. That really is the cause of the frustration, surely, in modern industrial society. And what do you do about it, and how do you tackle it? And I think all too little has really been done on this aspect of it.
Well, I'm sure work is not boring for 99% of the people. It may be boring for something like 30 or 35% of the people. That's the order of magnitude I would think of. And there, I believe one can do a lot to make it less boring.
Yes, I think that's right. It doesn't follow that working even a repetitious job is boring if you're able to converse with your neighbor, if there's a degree of conversation and chatting and joking with each other. But you see, the more you modernize methods of production, the more you try to eliminate the labor element, often the more isolated the job becomes. So that, for example, in a modern petrochemical plant, you will get 1 or 2 people watching an instrument panel in the control room. And that can be highly boring. They're required to be alert all the time, but they lack the friendship and conversation that in another type of job might be available. So you can enjoy work in many cases. The real problem often is getting work, getting enough work.
Shorter work hours and early retirement may be very, very desirable and should be permitted for some who want it. But on the other hand, those who don't want it, why not let them do what they want? I think that we have to take into account the biological fact that you need the feeling of having an outlet for your energy, of having some satisfactory recognition for your work, and that is a very major point in motivation.
There's a lot of things that can be done, and a lot of enjoyment of life, I believe, could be secured if we can improve the basic training skills of young people. After all, a lot of the vandalism and irresponsibility of youth arises because they've really lost an interest or haven't developed an interest in wider living.
And the boredom of leisure can be greater than the boredom of work.
I still disagree. I think the ennobling effect of tedious manual toil is greatly exaggerated, and I'm prepared to go through that, prepared both for myself and my children to avoid that ennoblement.
No, I'm going to jump up and down. I don't think it's ennobling. I think that not having ever experienced it means that you don't understand the problems of a very large part of society. And the reason why I think it's important to link the grant to it, I mean, I wouldn't stop people paying their own way, but if you're going to give a grant to people to go to university, I think it's a perfectly fair condition to say that they ought to have spent some time in the world outside the straight academic world, because the sequence of school, teacher training college, school, which is very, very common in all our countries, I think it's a wholly bad sequence. I don't think people know what they're teaching.
Well, I think that the role of formal education in shaping people in society has been much exaggerated. And I think that this altogether too much has been saddled on the schools, And the schools have become the great alibi for the breakdown of the other institutions of society. The family is no longer performing what its function had been at one point. The church is no longer doing it. The end of the apprenticeship system and things like that have meant that the problem of entry into the economic world is a much more impersonal thing. And as these other institutions have broken down, the other, I hate the terminology, but what the sociologists call the agencies of socialization or whatever, it's all been dumped off on the schools. And the school has become the great alibi for everyone else, for everyone outside the schools.
Who's everyone else?
As all the people who aren't teachers and students. They blame their own, those who are in this educational system.
Another subject that occupied everyone's attention, as it almost always does, was education.
Of the schools. I've been a student, I've been a teacher, and I know how resistant students are and how ineffectual teachers are. And the notion that schools by themselves perform a lever to change the system is wrong, partly because their capacity to affect deeper motivation is limited, and partly because they're reflections of the system of which they're endeavoring to change.
What would you say to the idea that everybody, virtually every employed person, should be required to, say, work at a manual job in a factory or in the docks or somewhere where they need to apply, as it were, basic trade training that they may have learned at school as part of the discipline in the approach to life? Because it seems to me we do suffer from, on the one side, unduly academic people who are prepared to tell people like me what we should do without perhaps a knowledge of what it means in terms of the practical workout.
I thought for a long time that one of the things we ought to do is to have a requirement that anybody who takes a university grant must have worked in an approved form of employment for at least a year. In other words, what I think we're doing is taking far too many kids straight from school into university without any wider experience of life at all, and very often as a result dropping out after the first year because they're fed up with what they're doing.
That's why I feel the whole problem of education has to be recast. I think we're still trapped by the conventional categories of life, childhood, adolescence, and so on. We suppose education is something that's completed at 22, and higher education fits into the 18 to 22-year-old box. Ridiculous. But it's now clear that many people aren't ready for higher education at that stage. They feel it themselves. That's why there's been so much tendency in the colleges for people who could, in another time, would have borne the intellectual load, but who feel in one way or another this isn't the time for them to do this, so they go off, they travel, they take a job. I think far from this being regarded as a kind of aberration or failure, it seems to me it's taking place on such a large scale that it's a perfectly natural response.
We are thinking of education and work and leisure and old age and retirement as if they were sort of mechanical boxes. And if somehow these boxes don't fit at one point, as they don't seem to between education and jobs at the moment, then we have a gap and we don't quite know what to do about it. Now, my view is to take this particular problem, but one of the answers is to reconstruct the boxes, as it were, or perhaps forget about the boxes and think of human life in a different way. Think of it in one context. Think of it as one continuing process. And the answer to that, to be more specific, is that, in my view, there should be a much closer integration of education and work. That is, when one talks about a reduction of the working day, one must have something in mind for what people are doing.
Well, of course, you've got to extend leisure opportunities.
Leisure opportunities.
Certainly. Yes, but they have to be active. But those leisure opportunities, of course, can be active, and they can include some do-it-yourself. I mean, no one's going to stop that process. Indeed, it would be a very good thing if more and more ordinary folk could do essential repairs around a motor car, for example, and understand what's wrong with a motor car. These are things that should be encouraged as part of the sort of way of life. But I don't exclude either the great opportunities for art that ought to exist for working people. After all, a lot of things which which professional groupings and highly educated people appreciate as normal, the appreciation of plays, of music, of painting and so on, it passes over the head of millions of ordinary people, of working people. Frankly, I know little about art. I've hardly ever seen a play and so on. And I am typical in that sense of lots of working men and women. So that we've got to encourage at the educational stage this appreciation, which would make life much more worthwhile.
I suspect the cost of change is greater than the ultimate cost of a new arrangement. It is the changeover which is generally costly. I mean, that is one of the great experiences, certainly in my life, that even reforms which are designed ultimately to get more out of every pound or every dollar are expensive in the first place. When you do it, when you change educational institutions, when you make different arrangements on jobs, when you change the system of pensions, that is actually costly and requires a relatively favorable period of economic development.
It's quite incredible. They want to take good and bad alike. They don't discriminate in the least.
As always, the discussion ends with economics, or at any rate with money. And in the case of Edward Heath, with nationalized industry.
Why don't you follow our policy of doing it in secret? We've just nationalized all the eastern railroads in secret.
I know you have, yes. That makes your point, doesn't it?
And
they're driven to resort to septuagenarians to try and run these things, retired professors.
They're bailing their capitalists out. It's all the same thing. You have to bail capitalists out. They can't bail themselves
But by
out.
doing it in secret, we avoid all this.
I agree with your government. It fell from 7 to 4. It then fell from 4 to 2.5 under ours, and it's a long, unbroken history.
Now it's lunchtime.
Alexander, come and have some food.
All right.
Arthur, having made all those valuable points this morning, come and
How do
have
you know?
some, every one of which I've heard many times before.
So I said, what time do I get to Marquette? There they said, we'll get there at 9:30. I said, what? 6 hours? I told it's just around the corner.
To the rear.
There's a nice calculation here. Enough food to stop hunger, but not so much as to send everyone off to sleep.
The rarest. These are all rare.
This would probably be the rarest.
I'm just going to get some sauce.
I think for a buffet lunch, we're doing all right.
Keep that going. Then unions and employers will be influenced.
Over lunch, Ted Heath takes time out to become eloquent on the British income tax.
And I've got these years to do before I retire, and that's that, and you take a perk of some kind or other. But when you're the lower management and you're looking to the future, you say, all right, well, I've done all my training, I've now done my own work, and here I am at 25, and what's the future? And the future is that I pay 83% as a minimum of everything I earn.
I'm sorry to have to correct you on your history, Arthur, but I'm prepared to do so. He was selected for vice president, and the campaign was well underway before it was agreed that he was constitutionally ineligible and was dumped.
So the fellow says, well, why should I go on with this sort of thing? I'll go off to... And what's more, the actual salary on which you pay 83% is roughly half of what you would get if you were in the Federal Republic, or in France, or these other countries.
Do you think that there'll be an emergence of national health service by the time it gets there?
Well, it's coming anyway, and it's promised.
At lunch, our guests decided to amalgamate the two seminars, have general conversation. One talks less, but misses less.
So we're losing the sunshine.
Depends where you look. Come on, everybody. Let's go right over there.
Over here.
I have induced.
I think I should do it, yeah? Thank you for...
Do we sit in a particular order?
Anywhere you like, sir.
Let's move this around so we won't be quite so visibly on the camera. As we would.
I want a comfortable chair.
The first topic was the developing countries, the third world. I'd ask Georgy Arbatov of Russia to start this discussion.
In general, I think the problem is there, and the problem has to be solved in coming decade at least. Otherwise, it will become a very acute and very serious problem. And I think how the so-called rich countries, advanced countries can help it. I have told about it. The first service would be to end the Cold War and attempt to use these countries for Cold War purposes. Then not to involve them in arms race and in the conflicts which we have in different parts of the globe. And I think also the solution of some problems, well, we have unsolved problems which are very dangerous in South Africa, some other places. I think that it was not yet really worked out by economists, by scholars in general, and by governments. The whole big subject of most effective way of assistance. There are different opinions, but of course education of specialists go with it. But all of it must coincide with internal changes in former colonial countries, with creation of such economic climate and social climate which will be really favorable to rapid economic development of these parts.
I think the whole of this discussion so far has been out of date and completely unrealistic. Bears no relationship to the modern world at all. The plain fact is that the Soviet Union has done almost nothing to help any developing country in the past 2 decades, unless it was putting in force. Its contribution towards the third world has been minimum, unless it was putting in force which it thought would change the regime to its own purposes. Now, when you come to look at the question of the third world, and you talk about the rich world, which is the rich world today? The rich world today is the oil-producing countries. That's the rich world, not Britain, not the rest of Western Europe, which has got large trade deficits. The rich world is the oil-producing world, which has got enormous surpluses, and which, first of all, doesn't know what to do with its surpluses, and secondly, if shown, is very unwilling to use them to any constructive purpose with the rest of its third world brethren. Then you come to this much more controversial political question about the help which you give to individual countries. I think it goes beyond ordinary human forbearance to say, all right, well, we will help such and such a country. And when they appear at the United Nations in a discussion, they kick us in the teeth. And the ordinary British voter says to himself, well, why am I contributing out of tax to help another country? And then at the UN, they just kick us in the teeth and say, you're absolute hell, you're an imperialist power, we disagree with everything you do, and so on. These are really very basic human considerations.
But many of these countries were your former colonies. And they, in one way or another, helped very much to prosperity of Great Britain and made it what it has become in 19th century, beginning the first half maybe of the 20th century. I think you cannot say that it's not your moral duty now because you are poor. This is also very relative. If the Americans, comprising 6% of the world population, consume 40% of world resources and feel themselves poor, it's another kind of being poor than these other countries. I think it has to be regarded as a special duty, the assistance to this country, of the countries of the former colonial countries.
You mentioned that your help to China was a disappointment. What was the disappointment? Why were you so disappointed about China? What did China do that, that was wrong? Well, I mean, I'm asking this in case in the future I became something important again, and if I were to solicit help from the great Soviet Union, I might not be a disappointment to you.
Well, you know, it's really a bit unfair to discuss this problem in absence of Chinese.
Well, it doesn't
Although
really matter.
every fourth of us had to be a Chinese, according to statistics.
Well, I have Chinese ancestors.
Yes, but I would say, you know, we, after Chinese Revolution, we took it. It was very emotional and sentimental, I would say, in our country.
Yes.
And we were very poor and in a very bad state this time after the war. Well, it lasted for maybe 1 decade or more when their opposition towards first moved towards detente in our foreign policy. When they criticized us for being not truly Marxist, that Marxist view would be only revolutionary wars, etc., etc. Beginning of 60s, then it became more and more distracted from any ideological schisms, and simply with territorial claims, with other things. I wouldn't say that many people in our country can understand it otherwise than they need, because of their internal difficulties, to have external enemies and surrounding which will help them to bring all of it together.
Yes, that seems to prove my point in the beginning. There's a great deal of ideological basis in these helps. And if you, having received the help, and you sort of deviate from the ideology of your helper, you become a disappointment.
Surely the job of politicians throughout the world, whether it's the left or the right, should be concerned towards helping countries like yours so that you can preserve a neutrality but develop trade and develop industry.
That's what I was hoping for.
Well, I'm trying to support you on this, you see. I think I'm supporting the voice of Thailand for neutrality. You see, we in Britain are not quite so altruistic as Heath has been suggesting. We do give a lot of overseas aid, and I'm all in favour of it, and I know he is. But a lot of our overseas aid is related to British goods going to the undeveloped countries. And not British goods, American goods, Russian goods, and so on. There's a lot to be said for that, if it's to raise the standard of people, if it's to bring them more into line in terms of standard of living with the more developed countries of the world. But it's how you do it without pressures, without undue influence, not only of a political nature, but of an industrial nature. And we in the trade union movement are very concerned about the attitude, for example, of multinational companies that are prepared to exploit the third world. And when we try to assist our brothers brothers and sisters in the third world, our brothers and sisters say, you're doing us damage. By trying to raise our standard of living, you are denying us employment, because the multinational companies then withdraw and move to another undeveloped country. This is a great problem for us, I don't...
But, you see, if you want to get out of the intergovernmental relationship, which produces political complications, much the best way of doing it is through individual companies.
Yes.
Because if a company invests in a third world country, then it not only brings money, which is what a government provides, but it also brings expertise and know-how, which a government doesn't provide, and it also goes into a partnership with the country which is developing, so that whatever it is, 50 or 60 or 70% is held in the shareholding and in the directorate by the company in which the country in which it bases itself. And this gives you a real partnership.
I said from the very beginning that to have the right kind of help, the poor countries are responsible for conditions within their own country to encourage the sort of help we're talking about, private companies and so on.
If you want an example that you've got Singapore close at hand.
Yes.
Tremendous development.
That's right.
Japanese money, German money, British money a bit, and all done in partnership with people who are there at the moment.
With a very strong central government control.
Well, not intervention. It's a very free enterprise economy.
Actually, it is a very free enterprise. Only the government has got more power than most, than the rest of us. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew seems to have done it very successfully.
Well, it's principally manifested, Jack, in an incomes policy along British that you have now imitated, isn't it?
I'm not sure. I think there's rather more dictation from the centre. I think,
And yet the secretary of the trades union is also a cabinet member in Singapore.
that's probably the reason.
Jack, I never knew you had aspirations in this way. You are insatiable.
No.
Are
But you
wishing
see,
to
what do you do?
formalize your present position?
What do you do? You've mentioned an incident, Ted, in Britain.
Yeah.
We are subjected in not only undeveloped countries, but developed countries, maybe outside of the United States of America, to the whim and will, to some extent, of multinational companies. And whilst I accept that many multinational companies are efficient, in dealing with labor, they're not all that bad, and we can negotiate reasonable wages and working conditions, there is just that threat that can be exercised, and unduly exercised, by multinational companies, which calls, in my view, for some form of international code which all countries who have to deal with multinational companies must adopt.
Is it preferable that there should be this mechanism for aid, which is divorced from ideology?
Oh yes, I'm in favour of that. That's what I hope we might be able to discuss.
That's the big question, if I may say so, because, and this is where I think I disagree very much with Ted Heath. If you look at the history of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, this isn't the history of a company without ideology. It's the history of a company with an acute ideology, which then plays very heavily on the weakness of the government to get its own ends. And if the company which is providing the investment is more powerful than the government of the country which it's coming into, and we took the case of Singapore where the government is probably more powerful, that's certainly not generally true, then you get a travesty of aid. And until we can move to the concept of some redistribution of income internationally as one of the goals of the international community, we will go on living in a world of Victorian charity, which is what aid essentially is. And that's why I think that even the kind of a penny in the pound, a penny in the dollar concept of international levies on nations, not as an act of charity, but as an obligation, would be at least the very beginning of the move towards what we need to see in relation to the third world, as much as what we've seen in relationship to separate nation states.
How could this be achieved, though? I mean,
Well, I think this is a very painful way, but an inevitable one. And the first experience we had here, it was with new prices on oil.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely right.
Because this goes about resources and prices, and many things which were produced in these poor countries were underpriced, and from rich countries were overpriced. And this, of course, is a very painful process for many countries, but it has begun, and I think it won't stop at oil. It will be true also for many others.
it's difficult getting agreement about this. But, see, to come back to Shirley's point, what are we really saying? What we're saying is we're asking citizens of Britain or America or Western Europe to accept a reduction in their standard of living in order to contribute to that of other people.
But I think that in some ways, Mr. Arbatov has answered that, because what he's really said is, and I think it's terribly significant, if you don't create a different structure, you will end up with, in effect, a collective bargaining situation in which the third world will force upon the first and second worlds its own requirements. Because in the end, the oil lesson is going to be learned, it seems to me, much more widely than by the oil producers.
The most powerful argument is power.
Yes, I mean, let's be just a little sceptical about this. It has happened with OPEC. And of course, when we produce oil, we become a member of OPEC, and then we shall have a very considerable influence on all these matters. But, I mean, is this really...
going to be Gaddafi of England.
Is this really, well, then we should be moving people with wealth. I mean, is this really going to happen over copper? Is it really going to happen over aluminium? Is it really going to happen over tin? Is it really going to happen over wool?
Could, you know.
It could, but is it really, in fact, going to happen?
It's a beginning movement with copper.
I tend to agree with Mr. Heath that the discussion is really out of date. We're talking about things that happened in the 50s, 40s and 50s. I don't think we need the sort of help from the so-called rich country at the sacrifice of the welfare of the people in the rich country. We need, the kind of help we need, I repeat again, is investment in our country to the mutual benefit on equitable sort of basis. I would like to point out the case between Japan and my country. We both have problems. Our problem is unemployment, though our wages are rather low. And their problem is high wages and cost. So they can't afford to produce the usual sort of cheap things that they produced before. They transfer the production of those things to our country where labor is cheap. We don't mind that at all because that created employment. But there is this. The profit center of the whole venture was in Tokyo and not halfway between Bangkok and Tokyo. That's the sort of thing that usually happens. And if that could be corrected, and then we're quite happy, we're quite satisfied, and we will discipline our union somehow to keep the level of wages within possible.
Don't discipline them too strongly.
Well, in that case, we'll beg them our bended knees.
That's better. That's a much better technique.
Yes.
The discussion now turned to the rights and functions of the individual in an age of high organization.
The fact is that in the underdeveloped country, or whatever we call the countries that are not industrialized completely, and in the industrialized countries, the individual tends to count for less and less, and we ought to take some account of how people, ordinary people, can express their point of view. The bigger the organization, the multinational company as an example, the bigger the government administration, the bigger the local authority, and the tendency is always to create bigger units. And the bigger the trade union, incidentally, the less the individual seems to have an opportunity to express him or herself. And without question, it seems to me that anyone looking at the world around us who wants to see change must find ways and means of pressing for greater opportunities for people, whether it's in industry or in society, to have a say in decision-making, influencing decision-making. In a way, this is what trade unions are about, or what they should be about. But in so many countries and in so many trade unions, the leadership tends to dominate, and the membership have little effective say. But nevertheless, the opportunity is there.
Well, I don't know, a couple of things about that, really. I think that, and I agree very much with Jack about the question of the individual being involved in participating in society. I think the problem is that we've got to get from the situation where the individual sees his role as being one of protesting to the state. In other words, saying to the state, this is what you should do, as distinct from sharing in the responsibility for decisions. And that's, as I understand it, what industrial democracy is about. Yes. So that it's part of this is the devolution of decision-making power from the state itself down the line as far as it possibly can go in respect of individual workplaces, in respect of local community neighborhoods in terms of their environment and their choices on that matter, in terms of things like schools involving parents, so that only half the battle is that the individual shall be better represented in making his protest. The much more difficult half of the battle is involving the individual in the sharing of responsibility. So I go with Jack on participation, but I think the much more difficult stage is the stage of shared responsibility.
Can I add another difficulty before we go on participation? We've been talking about underdeveloped or developing countries before and some of the world problems. I think we should be quite clear in our minds that we cannot solve all problems by participation. And that indeed there's a great danger that people who have a chance to participate delude themselves about the influence they have. We have problems of an international monetary system, and we won't solve them by participation, and yet they have to be solved. We have problems of the control of nuclear developments. We won't solve them by participation, and yet they have to be solved. We have problems of development in many parts of the world, and we won't solve them by participation, by industrial democracy, or any other kind of participatory system. Yeah, but I think it's quite important.
We're separated from the people. The people's future and welfare is affected by decisions about all these things.
I agree with you, and yet I cannot think of a system which, by immediate participation of all citizens, helps us to solve these problems. And that, I think, is quite a dilemma in which we are. And I think that, therefore, we have to think of other checks and balances for some of the great international decisions. That is, don't let us use participation as an alibi for those who continue to take the great decisions without having to ask anybody. That's the point I was really trying to make.
If you take the big issues which Jack has been mentioning, I mean, what has gone wrong with the proper means of dealing with those, which are the political institutions? I mean, these are political questions. Nuclear defense is a political question. The question of aid to the developing world and the other points you've mentioned. These are political questions, and we have political institutions to deal with them. In our country, well...
National institutions.
Yes, national institutions, a parliamentary institution. If you take it down locally, well, then we have constituencies, and within that you have wards and so on. Now, these are all the institutions. Well, then what has gone wrong with all of this? And I think one of the things that has gone wrong is that the citizen feels that on the other things which affect him, parliamentary institutions no longer really represent his views. And if you take, for example, capital punishment. Now, here Parliament has repeatedly stood for the abolition of capital punishment. If you had a referendum in Britain at any time over the last 20 years, there would be an overwhelming majority for capital punishment. That is still the case today. And so you have this feeling amongst the citizens. The same applies to immigration.
Of course, I suppose the question we're concerned with is the fate of the individual in the world of large organizations. I think it'd be a mistake to identify those organizations with a particular economic system or whatever. Now, this isn't a new question. No one thought about it more profoundly than Tocqueville a century and a half ago in Democracy in America, where he was concerned precisely with the fate of the individual in a mass society. And in effect, he came up with 2 points, and they seem to me still applicable today. And the first is the absolute importance of political freedom. Now, political freedom is qualified in countries which have it, where it allegedly prevails. It's limited, as our critics and we ourselves point out. But still, the rights of political opposition, however pallid they may be, are better than having no rights of political opposition at all. And I think, therefore, any serious consideration of the fate of the individual in the world of a large organization must understand that the individual is dead without a system which is devoted, however, which has as among its objectives and alleged rights, the rights of political opposition.
Would you include the position of the individual who has no alternative except to work for a large organization?
Should he have political freedom? Sure.
No. Would you describe that as an absence of freedom?
I would describe that as an absence of freedom, yes.
What you're emphasizing, which I agree with profoundly, is in a way a negative sort of freedom, which I think is basic You can ensure by laws in a parliamentary democracy that people aren't made to do things. But the real problem today is to go further than that and meet their aspirations. And by saying, yes, your freedom is also going to enable you to have the constructive things in life and to remove the uncertainty from yourself and your family. If we're talking about the age of uncertainty, then it seems to me the uncertainty with which we're really dealing is the uncertainty of the ordinary man in the street and his wife and his family and what's his future going to be and what his children, how they're going to be educated and what's their job going to be after that and where they're going to live and who's going to look after their health. And if they're ill, are they going to have to pay a fabulous bill or do they find a means either by voluntary contribution or through the state in which it's met? These are all the things which really concern the man in the street and his wife and his children.
There has to be some sort of leadership which you trust, doesn't there? I would say another thing, that in the 60s here, I think that there was an enormous movement. People really felt that they'd been misled, that their government was too big, that their organizations were too big, and that they as individuals couldn't affect them. We've grown, the Washington Post building has grown since I've been there 13 years, from about 1,300 to 2,800. And I now cope with some very real difficulties because people feel that we're cold, we're impersonal, that they're not loved, that people don't want to listen, that management doesn't care. I get that all the time. All I'm saying is that when you do care and you do want to do it right, it's still very hard to do. You have to replace the value of a small institution in which individuals all know each other and therefore can be heard with some very effective machinery through which they can make themselves heard, such as, say, an open door policy to the top executives.
Well, of course, we have the answer to that in Britain in industry, and that's the shop steward system, a continuous representation system, elected representatives. But I think you need to develop that and enrich it. At the same time, you've got to find some equivalent in society so that...
But, Mr. Jones, some of, as you yourself said, trade unions tend to become very undemocratic.
The way you ensure that they're democratic is to make sure that there's a lot of representatives selected at the bottom of the union machinery.
But like every organization, people get lazy and they don't go out and vote and they don't participate. And then, like every bureaucracy, the bureaucracy takes over and it's more undemocratic than any bureaucracy you can encounter when it gets rigid. And it's the first to prevent management from trying to reach people who work for them.
But a trade union shouldn't stand in the way of direct and effective representation of the employees to the management. That's what a trade union really should be about.
Well, it was very pleasant to hear such a lot of sound criticism on this side. Time not on Soviet Union, but on United States and Great Britain, and I share it, and I could add some things to it as well. But we have our concerns here, and a lot of things are being done. Here we are not completely satisfied, and I think when you speak about the right to oppose, well, we could rephrase it, the right for criticism, which is cherished in our country. I think it is very important, and we consider it to be very important. But at the same time, I don't think it is enough. And the main problem is, and there is no simple answer to this problem, how to really make people participate in decisions beginning from the grassroots. Of course, I have some grave doubts on how it will be done in the United States, how, for instance, the steel worker can influence the major decisions of U.S. Steel, or even the editorial policy of Washington Post. But I see certain search for it here in this country, and I think it's a very sound development.
Can I just ask one question really from the British-American point of view, because when I was over here 9 months ago, it was just after an article that appeared in Time, I'm sorry, it was the sort of rival concern, which was entitled Them and Us. And it was about a British firm called Rubery Owen. And it wasn't in any way malicious, and I'm sure it wasn't meant to be. But what it described was a situation in a medium-sized British firm, which it described how the chairman and managing director, which was originally a family business, lived in his very nice Tudor house, and his children were taken to prep school in the mornings in a car, and how he had his recreation at weekends and so on. And then it described what happened with the senior shop steward in the factory, and how he lived in a small local authority house with no garden, and his 2 children went to the Victorian primary school, and he went off to the pub, and so on. Now, everywhere I went in the States, whether it was in Wall Street, whether it was, I was a visiting fellow of Yale at the time, the students there talked to me about it. On the West Coast, they talked to me about it. And everybody said, but how can you run a country if you have this situation of them and us? Now, is it true to say that in the United States you don't have a situation of them and us?
There's them and us in the United States, but it's much easier for them to become us, or whatever. I mean, in other words, matters of birth, accent, all that kind of thing are far less decisive, or at least perceived as far less decisive. And therefore peanut farmers become presidents, and
we have a hell of a lot better mythology than you. And the ancient mythology of Britain is that of a class structure, and the equally and much more powerful mythology of the United States is of equality, mobility, and on the whole, the belief in both countries is strong, but if anything, our capacity for illusion is greater than yours.
You haven't read your Marx very well, Ken, if you believe that mythologies can be sustained for any length of time without a basis in fact. There must be some sort of basis.
Well, there's a little mythology everywhere, and I certainly wouldn't deny
the
that.
important thing about this discussion is that it seems to me we all recognize that there is a problem of ensuring that the ordinary factory hand, and whether it's a man or a woman, and the person in the street should have a say. We should encourage this participation. It's how you do it, how to have some form of continuous association, either in the streets or in the factories, that we need to look at and develop. And I think in the factories it becomes very much a question of the trade union operation. This is what trade unionism is about. It's not just about concluding a contract on wages and working conditions. It is about representing people and seeking to secure the freedoms which Ted Heath mentioned, the freedom of from unemployment and the freedom from insecurity and so on. These are vital factors which people want to do something about, and they should be encouraged to do something about them.
We were to continue our talks later in the evening in Newfane, our neighboring town 8 or 9 miles away. Newfane is the prettiest village in New England, which means the United States. It has also 2 superb inns where most of our guests were housed. Never before had it had such a concentration of cabinet ministers and former prime ministers, and in the finest Vermont tradition, no one paid any particular attention.
That's you? Is there a theory? Is there a theory? Bye, Kay.
I think you're right.
Yeah? That's very good. Very pleased. I hope before you leave this country, you will get a book. Victor Rutherford wrote. Victor has called the Brothers of Rutherford. He ought to send it.
There's probably an art in arranging dinner guests, but it can't be as recondite as my wife makes it appear. She leaves a place down at the end of the table for Henry Kissinger, who, of course, was Secretary of State when we had this meeting. Henry is being disciplined for arriving late.
Purely.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I think it was not.
Our guests started on the topics we've been discussing during the afternoon.
Our leader is about to speak.
Look at it like me.
Well, I not only remember the discussion, but I remember the instruction as to who was to start it. So as soon as he's had a chance to look at the menu, I'm going to ask Jack Jones to pick up the discussion of this afternoon, start the conversation on the, not on the negative form in which we all rejoiced this afternoon as to how difficult the problem of the individual is in a world of great organization, but in the affirmative sense of what we do about it. And
well, I think we're living in a time of very considerable change in this respect. Working people are more educated. They manage to watch television for one thing and see Kenneth Galbraith and take an interest in what he has to say.
certainly nobody is going to deny the impact of that.
There is a new trend in the sense that people question authority. They question authority in trade unions, they question authority of management, they question authority of governments. It's how you can apply that constructively. You see, we've learned that not all brains lie with the top. There's a collective experience that's necessary. And even in terms of product, take a motor car, the person who participates in the manufacture of a motor car these days often will drive that motor car. He's very proud of the product he's a part of. But he will have views to express about the performance and maybe the construction of the car that ought to flow up to management. And this is what we mean now by industrial democracy, to involve this expertise of the shop floor up to the level of management. We in Britain, the trade unionists in Britain, for the most part, not everyone, feel that it will add to the enrichment of the life of the worker. You'll feel much more a part of management decision-making, and in the process it can add to efficiency. Now, how far you can apply that to society, I don't know.
Can I ask you this, Arthur? I mean, my impression is that, you see, what Jack said is true in a lot of Western Europe at the moment. You've got Sweden, you've got Holland, you've got Norway, you've got Denmark, you've got Germany, all engaged in this great move towards what's called industrial democracy. It takes different shapes. It doesn't always take the same shape as it does in Britain, but it's a universal movement in Western Europe, and there's even the EEC attempt now to lay down what they call a European Companies Statute, which requires union representation, not perhaps again in the form that everybody's happy with, but nevertheless the move is all in the same direction. I mean, my impression is that the United States trade union movement is nothing like as pulled into the center of policy making as it now is in Western Europe. And why this is, I'm not quite clear, except that it seems to me that the trade union movement in the States has been astonishingly politically ineffective. Maybe it wanted to be.
It's taken different forms. Its intervention in politics have taken different forms. There hasn't been that relationship, for example, between the American labor movement and even the Democratic Party, comparable to the organic relationship that exists between the TUC and the Labor Party in England.
Sure.
I mean, there is also a feeling, which may be right or may not be right, that the more that labor, business, and government get involved in a collusive relationship and settle decisions among themselves, you get into the situation of a corporate society where these decisions are taken at the expense of all the we only have 28% of the labor force in unions in this country. So that which on the one hand means all the fears of trade union tyranny are nonsense, but which on the other hand means that the trade unions cannot legitimately claim to represent the entire working force. And the problems of, as I say, collusion between big business, big labor, and a subservient and acquiescent government that's a serious question, which the proponents of Professor Galbraith's income policy will answer for us.
With great respect, you're begging one of the questions there, aren't you? Because you're saying a subservient government. We've got less than 50% of our workers in trade unions. That's also true. But if a government is going to deal with anybody at all, then the only people it can deal with is the organized trade unions. But in doing that, and in dealing with employers, then it has got a responsibility to represent the consumers, as we said earlier on today, but also all of those people who aren't in fact in unions. What worries me more than anything is how do we create a situation in which the individual who's got the initiative and got the incentive will in fact do things for himself. Now, you asked me about the individual, and that's the thing which most concerns me today.
This comes down as a practical matter to how the small firm, the independent entrepreneur, can make his way against the large enterprise or against the...
Or how the worker can be sure to get a job.
Or the...
Yes, and against the bureaucracy and against the tax system and against all those things which discourage him from doing it at this moment. Against every sort of planning regulation, against every sort of restrictive practice, against every sort of activity. I mean,
the first consideration is a job, Ted.
Huh?
How do we ensure that everybody has the right to a job?
Yes, but that is an allied question, because if you have individuals who get the opportunity of doing this for themselves, they create jobs for other people.
I'm not against the small businessman, and maybe there's a case for encouraging it in some of the craft trades. But in fact, the idea is a bit outmoded. You know, in so many areas of industry, you quite frankly, the small businessman couldn't compete with modern mass production. And it's the big mass production units where the impersonalization occurs.
I suppose the difference between production and services. In services, the small entrepreneur still has a role.
In still keeping the affirmative tone, which we more or less successfully tried to sustain. What's the most important thing that needs to be done to affirm the position of the individual consumer?
It won't work like that. You can't really create an organization of consumers. They don't work that way. Their common interests aren't sufficient for that. But what you can do, and I think must do, is to give them a bit of muscle in the sense of the kind of expert backing that Ralph Dahrendorf was talking about in another context. And let me look at three sorts of consumer interest. One sort is the straight desire not to be exploited. In other words, not to have a situation in which you could see the two sides of industry coming together and simply passing costs along to the consumer, and if the consumer is helpless, that situation can't be resisted. Secondly, you've got a consumer interest vis-a-vis government itself. And government, whether it's, we were saying that this afternoon, whether it's central or local, has lengthened the lines of communication, in some cases beyond the point where it communicates at all, has lost touch to a very great extent with the man and woman in the street, and tends to work increasingly through layer after layer of bureaucracy to the point where its voice isn't even heard clearly by the people it's meant to be addressing. And I think that many of the mistakes that have been made, not least by architects and planners, would not have been made if there had been the kind of consultation with the human being at the end of the process that Jack Jones was talking about earlier in the case of industry, where he wants the worker in the plant to be consulted. And yet we haven't developed really any very effective techniques for doing this, except after the thing has happened. After it's happened, we deal with the protests. Before it's happened, we've got no effective machinery for trying to avoid the protest before it happens. And you asked me for a constructive view, well, I'll give you two. And I think that in the case of civil servants, no civil servant should take up his post or should be promoted until he's spent at least a period of time at what you might call the shop front, dealing with the individual, either approaching him for unemployment benefit or approaching him for a pension or whatever it may be, so that he or she has a real sense of the public with which he or she is meant to deal and to which in the end they're the servants. And at least in our country that happens very little, far less than it should.
Surely, is there any nadirism in England? I mean, the use of the lawsuit as a means of consumer challenge, and anything that results in a court decision automatically applies, therefore, to 100%.
Nothing like it is in the States, but the pressure of the consumer movement, and here again the parallel with the trade union movement is not bad, is of course on statutes.
Because
in other words,
the technique, in addition to statutes, the technique of the lawsuit is a useful one.
It is a useful one, but it's not widely used.
No, not the lawsuit.
Hey, Shirley, can I try another one? I've spent 12 hours listening to this high-flown verbiage about problem solving and returning. Hasn't it been nearly 12? Seems it. And returning it to the people. And I've heard one mention of the only medium, only media that the people read, television and newspapers. And it really quite appalls me that this group of heavy thinkers haven't thought about the public education techniques that we've used in this country with some success, I think.
Come over and reform the British press.
Well,
it's also fine over here. I'm not too sure that it's fine over in Britain.
I'm talking about television.
No, it's my personal observation. I don't think the British press, however bad it can be, should learn very much from American press.
I think that's right.
What's your problem with the American press?
Oh, we have a lot of them.
For starters.
Well, many political things, how they were handled. And I have my observation in general, if we switch to this subject, that the sensationalism, which goes quite contrary to the needs of public education, such stress upon violence, upon many other things, which has become a sort of public education of a very negative kind, I think, in this country. And although there are exceptions, there are good articles, some papers, but if you take it as a whole, especially, well, these papers which have the widest circulation, maybe.
Of course, we can't hope to achieve the balance and impartiality attained by Pravda and Izvestia in these matters, but we do our best.
Well, maybe you should learn a little bit from them as well.
Can I ask you a question? I mean, you've got a great tradition in the States of what used to be called muckraking journalism, and I suppose at the highest level one might describe the Watergate business as the very highest kind of muckraking journalism. I mean, in a sense, the press became the loyal opposition over that. What I want to ask is, at what point does the press have a greater responsibility towards matters that are crucial to the well-being of its society, or does it always have a greater responsibility to its readership to give the readership what it may want?
Well, I think it's one of the most interesting problems the press has is what is its role in society. And I think that there are certain things we can do and try to do, and certain things we really probably can't and shouldn't, because there are limitations to what we can do. And there are limitations of time, of space, of the degree of sophistication of the reporters that are handling these subjects. And there are all sorts of constrictions. Walter Lippmann used a very good phrase once. He said, he was making the point that the press couldn't replace institutions. that its obligation was to inform as best it could, and that by doing this, it was in effect what he called a restless searchlight in the dark, illuminating here and there. That if you call attention to problems in an intelligent way, and get the facts to people, that then institutions do really have to take over. And I would say that the Watergate instance is an instance of that, because what the press did was to keep the issue alive while the institutions were not working.
Definitely. Nice to see you. Good to see you. Secretary Kissinger is arriving.
Yes. You know, cook it fromage. Nice to see you. Now we have yes, we sat next to each other. This man? Ted. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. You know that you're a good coffee cup. Hello. They know what it means. Georgy Arbatov? Yes, nice to see you. Hello, I haven't seen you in ages.
This is Hans Henry.
Yes, I've eaten them.
You can now arrive at clearing. Well, Secretary, there's been a orientate towards the sun. We thought you would be lonesome if you didn't have some television cameras. And so you will not be lonesome. Now I'm going to turn it over to you, Ted.
Whatever it may be.
What are you turning over? I'm turning over to you now to shift the question of how does the press serve, help, hurt in informing on the complex and technical issues which have to do with, for example, a large issue like your entry into the common market.
The last time I spoke on this subject, Kay Graham walked out.
Henry, I hate to tell you, I don't even remember that. I think you made it up.
You had a dinner party, but I didn't know you did.
I think that we've been arguing about the press in various aspects and so on, and the media as well. I would have thought, broadly speaking, that on foreign policy, the press does a better job than it does on many other aspects of international life. Because in most countries, at any rate, there is still a general agreement between political parties that foreign affairs is something which ought to be kept out of the ordinary dogfight and ought to be dealt with on a rather higher level than most of the current discussion in the press or in Parliament. Now, of course, it can be that foreign policy does at times become so entangled in domestic affairs that it's very difficult for them to do this. But it does raise the basic question, well, is it a good thing to have the whole of foreign policy discussed in the press?
I think it is a difficult issue, but I think that it has to be resolved in our country, which is really very unlike yours. We do not have a parliamentary democracy. And to some extent, we don't have the questioning devices that exist in Parliament, or the royal commissions, or the devices you have to question the government, or in fact the ability to make the government fall if the people want to. So you have to start from the fact that we have a different problem. And in this country, for a long time, I think the press was not skeptical enough and did not report enough. And I certainly don't think that in the early days of Vietnam, enough people were reporting what was really going on in Vietnam. We were taking the official version of it much too literally. I think that when you say that there are government secrets, we all know there are, and I think that it is the view of the press in this country that it is up to the government to keep those secrets. But that once one of them leaks, that it really does much more harm than good to then say we want to get it back, and you all have to agree not to publish it. I know that the Official Secrets Act seems to work in England, but I feel that it would be very damaging here. I think that the government has...
Great criticism in England,
I
and
think-
a review.
I think the government...
Commitment to change.
The government has put in new proposals to change
Yes,
it.
but I'm present from both points of view that in fact the existing act is not effective in dealing with breaches of security which matter. But from the point of view of the parliamentary system, you see, you have a security question. The Prime Minister can stand up and say, this matter has been raised, but I must assure the House that this is a matter of security. And the Parliament will not press the Prime Minister on that. And he will say, I'm perfectly prepared to tell the Leader of the Opposition in the usual way, under Privy Council oath, the whole of the facts about this. And the Leader of the Opposition comes along to his room directly after question time. He says, look, this is the whole situation. And then Parliament says, this is a matter of national security. And we are not going to expose all of this in public. Now, take another example. Take Northern Ireland. I don't think many people in Britain are in doubt that a very large amount of the coverage given by television and by radio to the IRA in Northern Ireland has impeded to an enormous extent the ability of the forces to deal with the IRA. No doubt about it at all. And what that has meant is that a large number of civilian lives have been lost and forces' lives have been lost.
Why should the television coverage have impeded?
Because television takes the view that if they can get a secret interview, so-called secret interview, with the IRA in some back street in Belfast or Londonderry, then they do that. They will not reveal where the IRA are operating. And it gives the IRA the opportunity on television of putting across a speech.
Television is, I mean, BBC is better intelligence service than British government?
Well, to the extent the IRA will send a message to the BBC saying, if you meet such a man in such a place, such a time, then you will be taken unbeknown and blindfolded to another place. And there we will give an interview on television or on radio. And the conditions are, of course, that you don't reveal this. In any case, you're blindfolded, you won't know where you're going. And if you do reveal it, your life is in danger because we will take jolly good care that you're bumped off after it.
Anyway, it seems to me that governments abide by a set of unwritten rules about how they behave. Now, if you take one historic example where governments didn't obey that set of unwritten rules, it was the case of the British government at the time of Suez, because the matter was not an issue which came to Cabinet. It was resolved at Cabinet level. It was resolved by a much smaller group of ministers who, in effect, concealed from the Cabinet what they were intending to do. Now, I think the press was not wrong to pick up a Suez issue and to fight the government on it. And I think the press has a right, in a sense, to break the rules if government itself, in a democracy, breaks the rules.
Yes, but if you go back to Suez, and you say the press broke the rules, the reason wasn't that they believed the Cabinet hadn't been informed about the decisions. In actual fact, of course, the Cabinet was fully informed about the decisions.
Well, not at the beginning.
The press took this view because they were against this particular venture.
Well, that's also a point. When I get to Henry Kissinger, I want him to make the difference between what he would like to have now that he's in power, as distinct from 5 years hence when he's a Harvard professor again.
It's complicated from the point of view of analysis. And I think the first part you have to divide up is the defense foreign affairs aspect from the domestic aspect, insofar as you can have that division. And here, I think you are dealing with confidentiality as compared with what I would call security. Now, on confidentiality, I take the view that a government is just as entitled to be able to discuss policies with its administrators, with the civil service and its colleagues, as any other organization in the country is. Now, I do not find that the press accept this. In other words, if Kay found that one of her senior executives, after every board meeting, was going out and telephoning the New York Times and telling them what had happened, she really wouldn't be very amused. And yet the press takes it for granted that a civil servant ought to be able to do this. and ought to be able to ring up the press and say, well, there was a meeting in the cabinet today in which there was a row between so-and-so and so-and-so, and you ought to know all about this.
Well, wouldn't distinguish between a private organization and a publicly elected, democratically accountable...
I don't accept this.
Oh,
I don't think there is.
We used to have those arguments. I insisted, and Kennedy insisted in publishing the documents. All the State Department predicted all sorts of terrible consequences. Some of these had to do with Thailand and some with China. Documents were published, had absolutely no consequences at all.
Mention of Thailand allows me to ask the former premier of Thailand what rule he would invoke on...
Well, it depends on state, on the responsibility of the press. The press in the United States, of course, are different from the press in England, and it's, as regards the Thai press, they're unbelievably irresponsible. So, my rule is never to give information that affects national security or national interest. They'll invent it if you don't give it to them, but then you can always deny. That's about all there is to it.
How do you define national interest and national security?
Well, you know, you're coming, Ken, to the one point, which is finally, in a democracy, there are some things on which you have to trust a government. Yes. Otherwise, a nation cannot survive.
Ted.
And if the Americans haven't learned that as a result of the last 10 years, then it makes us, their friends and allies, despair of it.
How do you make the division between what is obviously necessary to know, as distinct from, and what categories would you seek to see reserved from use, kept secret?
Well, first of all, I think one has to make a distinction between what the government should tell the public and what civil servants should have the right to tell the public. I believe that it is imperative for presidents or prime ministers and other leading cabinet members to give the public the fullest possible explanation of what they are doing. And to do it with revealing as many of the choices they think they have and the reasons why they have chosen as they have as possible. On the other hand, if every official believes that when he loses an internal argument, he can then peddle his paper to the newspapers, it has a disintegrating impact on the government. Now, I have sympathy for what Kay said, that it ought to be the government's responsibility to be able to keep it secret, and not the newspapers. And how you bring about the degree of discipline, which I think is needed, I have not really thought through. But I can say now, for example, when I receive a cable, which I should simply note, since I'm assuming that it will leak, I write an answer so that if it leaks either to a congressional committee or to the press, I have a record of my point of view. Now, this already distorts the process of government. People ought to be able to communicate with the Secretary of State without engaging in an endless internal debate. Many things, if you speak about the impact, and I repeat, I'm not blaming the newspapers for it, I'm simply describing the situation. The impact on the government now is that almost any paper that is being written for internal deliberations has to be looked at also from the point of view of how it will appear in print. And now you may say that's the way it should always be looked at. But there are many intangibles in decision-making in which it is absolutely necessary to work through candidly a number of options which you would later reject, and in which if every advisor has to worry about how he will look in print 3 weeks later or 3 months later or a year later, is going to have a debilitating impact on decision-making. Therefore, I would think that it is quite clear that the presidents, prime ministers perhaps ought to be more candid than in the situations that you describe. But this does not, in my view, entitle officials, except under conditions of a total breakdown of public confidence, to play their own game. Because what very often happens is it's precisely the people who have some hobby horse who are pushing it most strenuously. And it is almost impossible for the press to distinguish between the validity of the various secret documents that are now practically being forced on them. I don't know what I would do if I were a publisher. Having stated this problem, the easiest solution would be to get discipline in the government. But how you can get that with all the present impact, I have no answer to. Now, if I could, since I may not get the floor again, knowing this eloquent group here, if I could make a few comments on some other things that were said here.
Can I just take you up on one point, Henry, on this? I mean, let's take a practical. let's take a practical point in negotiation. I was going to attack Shirley Williams. Let's take a practical point in negotiation. We both know perfectly well that you can have a situation in which one side will make an advance to the other, in which, if it's reciprocated, you're going to have a successful outcome, and therefore you can stand the cost or the racket, whatever you like, of the advance you make. On the other hand, if you don't get the response, it's extremely damaging to the government, the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, whoever it may be.
Very good point.
Now, that, I believe, is a crucial instance where if the press come to know about it, there is a very heavy responsibility on them not to publish that, because it endangers the success of the operation, because the other side is also in the position that if they respond and don't get success, they're in danger as well. Now, if this is known in State Department and the Foreign Office, Kate, or say wherever you like, and the whole thing is likely to be blown, and there is no responsibility in the press, you won't get initiatives.
Initiatives like the Bay of Pigs?
Like what?
Like the Bay of Pigs?
I think the initiative you mentioned was also not the best
operation, and if it had been successful, we should never have heard anything but praise for it.
I think I better get you back to attack Shirley Williams.
No, I was going to make a partially irrelevant point to the one our discussion has now reached. I don't believe that the intelligence investigations necessarily prove the influence of the press one way or the other. With respect to a point that Kay made on the Pentagon Papers, I think the government got itself into a hopeless position when it was forced to defend the secrecy of individual papers that extended over a period of years, because it was quite impossible to demonstrate in any individual case the secret aspect of the paper. In fact, the mere requirement of forcing the government to prove why something is secret and thereby revealing the secret will make the government most reluctant to contest the case. The impact of the Pentagon Papers was the cumulative nature of 40 volumes of secret documents being able to be published, and the caution it must have inspired in other governments in their ability to deal frankly with the United States, and also for opening the floodgates for the sort of situation that now exists, and which in my view has to be brought under control after the election, in which almost every civil servant feels free to go public with any point of view that he may have had on which he was overruled, or uses either the press or the Congress to bring pressure on the administration. Now, I am quite sympathetic to Kay's point that the primary responsibility is with the government and not with the press. But the consequences in the foreign policy field, I would agree with Ted.
Would you not also say that the government itself releases confidential documents when it wants to sell its point of view quite often, Henry? And would you reserve the right to the government to use them when they saw fit, but not to the right of the government's opposition?
Well, I think we should assume that the Watergate phenomenon is an exception and not the rule of government. One should assume that the government requires a minimum of trust. I can give, since this will not appear for several months. Last week we had a difficult situation in Lebanon, in which we were trying to evacuate Americans, and in which their departure was delayed. We deliberately, not because we wanted to hide anything from the public, refrained from blaming the PLO because we did not want to turn it into a test of strength with the PLO, and because we thought that the lives of the people was more important than some grandstand play. Within days, it was leaked what the obstacle was, what our concern was, and until we get these people out, we still don't know whether this does not greatly complicate the issue. Now, this is a case where there's no policy dispute within the government at all, and where it's simply some official who's trying to prove to some columnist that he's a big shot and is in on some information, is releasing information that next Wednesday or Thursday would do nobody any damage, and that does nobody any good this week.
Is that released from the field, Henry, or from the State Department?
Well, in this particular case, the State Department is guilty enough in these matters. In this particular case, I don't believe it came from the State Department. It came from somebody who wanted to prove how able his organization was in effecting evacuations. It wasn't even malicious. It was just self-serving, but potentially very dangerous. We hope it won't be dangerous, but the reason we kept that particular sequence of events secret is, even though we revealed the general fact that we couldn't make the evacuation, the particular conditions which inhibited the evacuation we kept secret simply so that we could complete the process, and once completed, there'd be no objection whatever to make clear who did what to whom and what we did.
Why is the press so anxious to damage the national interest wherever it can find it?
That's a good question, Kay. Why?
That's clear, Ted, really.
That question is obviously addressed to you, Kay. So
I'm being asked if I've stopped beating my wife.
Sunday morning. Catherine Graham and Shirley Williams were staying with us up at the farmhouse. Mrs. Graham had breakfast with us, and she demanded to know what we had paid for this house and 250 acres 30 years ago in 1947. I told her it was $6,750, about 1,600 pounds in those days.
At least other people work for theirs. They don't just sit on real estate.
Well, I tell you, I never said it. I've painted it. I've kept it from pulling down for 25 years.
I want you to know this is unearned increment.
Shirley Williams was more energetic and took my daughter-in-law's horse out for a ride. The horse is a sprightly 15-year-old.
It's a lovely horse. Very nice rabbit.
Want me to demonstrate now?
About 10 o'clock, the other guests began to arrive from the inns at Newfane. The discussions were to break up at lunchtime, some to catch planes, more, including Ted Heath, to attend the famous Marlborough concerts, which are nearby.
How do you eat them raw?
My wife puts them, just plucks off the...
Before the serious business, it turned out that some of the guests had found a new use for lilies.
Somebody said you were eating bay leaves. No.
Lilies.
Oh, the lilies?
Yeah.
What do they like?
Well, they're they're rather tasty, like cucumber.
Raw.
And if you cook them, you can cook them like beans.
What do you call these?
Bay lilies.
Bay lilies?
Day. You know, they bloom one each day. One day.
People come up to me and say, you don't look as bad in real life as you do in pictures, which is an unsettling experience.
I didn't like to say that.
They don't say I look good, but they say it's not as bad.
She says she speaks perfect with an Uzbek accent. I've sat in on a number of conversations and negotiations between national leaders, and they sound very much like those you're about to hear. However, for me, as I imagine it will be for you, this was my first chance to eavesdrop on conversations at the summit between American and Soviet leaders. It will be, as you see, on by far the most urgent issue of the age. This was the discussion about nuclear diplomacy and control. On one or two technical points, I'll interrupt with an explanation. Some of our guests, you will see, took notes for themselves. Ted, you stand between the relevant powers, so you lead off on this.
I'm not sure it's a very good thing for me to lead off on this one. I thought the two superpowers would really set out their position.
It's only appropriate they be given a suitable sense of modesty.
Because you said we don't necessarily want to concentrate on negotiation, but after all, that is going to be the main feature of...
I think I misspoke on that. What I don't want to concentrate on is past blame. Arbatov has persuaded me that we're wicked, and everybody else has persuaded me that the Soviets are wicked, which, of course, deeply I believe. And since we've established both of those points, I would like not to pursue them further.
Well, let me just then give a brief introduction to that, and then the others can carry on. My experience has been, over the last 15 years, that the way we make progress is by negotiation, which one has to accept is very hard bargaining, and which takes a certain amount of time to achieve, in fact, much longer than anybody realizes. And that when an agreement is reached, then it has stuck. And if one takes the various agreements which we've had, I mean, the Test Ban Treaty, which we negotiated as a government with the American administration and with the Soviet Union, it took us a long time to get it, and there wasn't everything in it which we would have liked. But on the other hand, this has stuck. And then when we came to the non-proliferation, there was a similar long period, very hard negotiation. But once it was reached, it stuck. And so I think there is room for reasonable optimism about this. It does mean that one's got to be prepared to take a considerable amount of time, and it's pretty rough going before you reach a conclusion. The next complication is that we're moving into a period in which there are other nuclear powers, and not only the superpowers and the two European ones. The Chinese are developing, and we may see others develop. This makes the overall picture very much more complicated and very difficult for the two superpowers themselves to handle, I think. And I don't know that enough thought has really been given to this aspect of future negotiations as far as the nuclear are concerned.
Well, I think that Ted Heath has stated the case admirably, and there's very little I'd like to add so far as Europe is concerned. Incidentally, my own history in this is nothing except the negotiation of the verification agreement between the European Community and the International Atomic Energy Organization relating to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there's one point which I would like to add, and where I'd very much like to have some discussion, and that is, if the nuclear future of the world was simply determined by relations between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, I would not be particularly worried. I'd be quite prepared to settle for the kind of cautious optimism which Ted Heath has expressed. However, it seems to me that the real problems we're going to face are the two problems of nuclear proliferation, which you mentioned, and of nuclear terrorism. And it seems to me that we really haven't devoted enough thought to these two problems, and I would like to underline the latter problem, that is nuclear terrorism. Frankly, I was asked in the course of our discussion by Tom, in fact, whether I was on the whole optimistic or not about the future of industrial societies and of mankind. And my answer was and is, if it were not for the nuclear threat, I would probably be on the whole optimistic and believe that we can cope with all the major issues ahead of us in the developed and in the developing world. But the nuclear threat itself is something which I believe we haven't coped with at all, and I'm profoundly frightened about the next 20 years and what might happen, quite apart from what the superpowers do.
The Europeans have outlined their worries. Now for the superpowers. Now, Georgy Arbatov starts the discussion on arms control and how to achieve it. He begins with a glance at the agreements that have just been made.
I think we cannot underestimate the things which were done already, because one could suspect that the picture would look much gloomier if we hadn't this agreement of 72. I have in mind a special agreement on ABM. If we hadn't Vladivostok Accord, maybe the things would be still worse. But nevertheless, we have to look to be very realistic about it. And we can say that despite the time, despite many agreements we have concluded, the arms race goes on. And on some very dangerous points, it intensifies. And I am very much concerned, well, I'll keep to your advice, and although it's nice even in such gloom situation to know that you are morally right, but I feel that we have the satisfaction. I won't speak about it, but I'll put out one of the problems which makes me especially concerned. That the political process of negotiating arms control lags very much behind the technological progress in armaments fields. And so we get in some sort of vicious circle when we have to try to solve old problems. And meantime, new weapon systems are created which bring in new, even more complicated problems. And this vicious circle has to be torn somehow.
There are two basic categories of problems in relation to nuclear peace. One is the political relationship of the two countries. The other is the strategic relationship of the two countries. Arbatov wanted to separate these two and say that the nuclear relationship can be stabilized in the absence of stabilizing the political relationship. Given the enormous complexity of the discussion on nuclear controls and nuclear stability, given the fact that it is a really very unusual approach involving unconventional thinking, there's no practical possibility of getting a significant degree of nuclear disarmament and nuclear control if there is not also a measure of restraint in the political field. I don't think it is possible to advance the proposition that the two countries can press each other to the limit in the political field while they should regularize their armaments with each other. And I think both sides, not just the Soviet Union, have an obligation to keep in mind that they're living in a very unusual world. The sort of gains that one can make on the level of traditional balance of power politics are really quite marginal compared to the risks that are involved in terms of our long-term future and the permanent benefits that can be achieved from it. And while it is of course true that the Soviet Union and the United States, as two superpowers impinging on each other all over the world, are bound to be in competition, and while ideology is going to produce frictions, it is also true that the leaders of both sides need a new dimension of thinking and not press every opportunity to its ultimate conclusion. When I think back over the last 15 years, we were talking about it informally before, I was at the very fringes of the Kennedy administration without any influence whatsoever, but I know that in 1961, my colleagues entered the government with the firm intention of making progress in the relations with the Soviet Union, and then the Berlin crisis set matters back for 3 years to no benefit to anybody. I would therefore urge that there must be political restraint, and there cannot be selective détente, and want the record to show that this word has been introduced by Mr. Arbatov, and only politeness as a host country induces me to use it, and under no circumstances would I otherwise disobey firm instructions. But but it isn't possible either to have detente that is applied to the nuclear field and not to the political field, or detente that applies to the center of Europe but not to Africa or Asia. This doesn't mean that we will not be competing to some extent, but some limits have to be put on the competition, some restraint has to be exercised. And this is an injunction I would make to both sides, not just to the Soviet Union. Now, with respect to the nuclear field, it is an unprecedented situation for nations to face the problem of having too much usable power. Until the end of World War II, it would never have occurred to anybody that a country could have more power than was either strategically or politically useful. The people who have spent their life in military services, and I would suspect on both sides, find it very hard to come to grips with this. So in their own analysis, they tend to speak of superiorities and dangers that are really quite theoretical when casualties involve hundreds of millions globally and probably over 100 million in each of our societies in case of a general nuclear war. So I do agree that there is a moral and political obligation to push back the danger of nuclear confrontation and to put some stability into nuclear armaments and then to reduce them. And it is therefore, in my view, absolutely imperative that we come to an agreement on strategic arms. Now, this is intellectually a complicated problem because the rate of technology changes more rapidly than up to now has been the pace of negotiation. In order to inject some controversy into this debate, I must say that just as there has to be restraint in pushing our political contest, we also ought to be careful in not making proposals which to the other side tend to appear slightly cynical. For example, it's an eloquent proposal to stop all new weapons deployments. It would be more convincing if it did not happen at the precise moment when the Soviet Union has completed its research and is already in production, and just before we are in production of comparable weapons. If the Soviet Union were prepared to stop the deployment of the SS-17, 18, and 19, then we could talk about stopping the deployment of the B-1 and Trident.
Henry Kissinger is speaking about the new Soviet intercontinental missiles with multiple re-entry warheads. The B-1 is the controversial American man bomber, and the Trident is an American intercontinental missile system for submarines, a replacement for Polaris and Poseidon. The argument continues.
But to be asked that we should stop the new weapons we have just because they are 12 months away from production, while the Soviet Union is 12 months into deploying its new weapons, it's the sort of debate that makes propaganda out of the negotiation.
And I would disagree with you, Dr. Kissinger, on the point that the proposal to stop development and deployment of nuclear weapon has a propagandistic value because we have concluded development of some weapons of ours. And here I have to return to history a little bit, because actually for the whole post-war period, the United States had the lead. They had the nuclear weapons, we hadn't. Then for a time they had the means of delivery, we hadn't. And it happened all the way so. And now if we look at the picture, I think a question arises, who runs after whom in this arms race actually? I feel that we are trying to achieve hard facts of life, so hard that they are cast in metal and deployed already in American weaponry all the time. At the same time, in the United States, there is some picture of what the Soviet strategic forces will look or can look in 10 or 15 years. And then there is a begin for new armed weapon systems. And this makes it very difficult. This weapon system you mentioned, they are an answer for a decision made by the United States in the early 70s. MERT, missiles. And this was such a new introduction in arms race that it was clear, I think, for all Americans that we had to do it as well. If we have agreed that we have approximate parity, then we had to do it. But now United States begins a new round in their defense programs. And if it is made, then we'll follow. But in this case, I don't see any ways to really to break up this other vicious circle. And I think when the proposal was introduced to stop this development, deployment of weapon system, it was not a propaganda. It was, I'm sure, a very sincere offer to the United States to discuss these things. Because
Oh, I'm sure it was sincere. It is just unilaterally to the Soviet advantage.
no, we only had to reach the level you have achieved a few years before it.
Well, it seems to me that if we talk about the concrete realities of the near future, I think it is possible, with difficulties in this country, but nevertheless possible, to achieve an agreement on the Vladivostok basis. That will involve some negotiations on some weapon systems that some of our people have questions about in the Soviet Union, and some on weapon systems that your people have questions about in the United States. I think that it's going to be a difficult but manageable negotiation, and we shouldn't forget that, in my view, 90% of the agreement is either conceptually or actually completed. So we should concentrate on that remaining 10% and get it done. That can be done without this issue of banning new weapon systems. That could be put into the next negotiation.
But otherwise they will be simply deployed and will be out of negotiations anyway.
Otherwise they will be deployed, because if you introduce the idea of new weapons, then we inevitably are going to introduce new weapons. The idea of new weapons, then we will have to define what is a new weapon. And then we will run into complications that we can't even imagine today, because the experts on both sides are going to get into endless definitions of what new weapons are.
Yeah, are you really saying that the way to deal with this now is just to be specific about weapons, up to the Vladivostok totals, and not to try to have an overall principle, so to speak, which will lead to all these arguments?
The Vladivostok agreement is that there should be fixed ceilings of 2,400 for both sides, within which each side can compose it of whatever weapon it wishes that has been defined as strategic in this agreement.
The discussion now turns from the relations between Russia and America to the spread of nuclear weapons, to nuclear proliferation.
To what extent would you believe that it is the United States and the Soviet Union, or perhaps the United States alone, which has a major role to play in the attempt to control nuclear proliferation? Or putting the question the other way around, to what extent do you think there is a function for international institutions which will have to be revived in order to cope with the problem? Is this a matter of arrangements between major powers, or is it a matter of setting up or reviving existing institutions?
Let me say one thing on behalf of the Soviet Union here. In the field of nuclear proliferation, I must say that the Soviet Union has on the whole behaved responsibly. It has not pushed the question, it has not pushed its own export of nuclear installations to anything like the extent that, say, the European community has. And in the nuclear...
This is peaceful nuclear.
Peaceful nuclear. I'm speaking about nuclear proliferation, peaceful proliferation. Yes.
But you weren't dealing with that, right?
No, not really, but of course
But that's what you're really talking about in the nuclear proliferation field. I don't think that any major country or any country is going to give away nuclear bombs. So when we're talking about nuclear proliferation, to me it suggests the utilization of peaceful nuclear technology for weapons purposes by the recipient country. This is my definition of the nuclear proliferation problem.
A limited definition.
Well, but there hasn't been any case of a superpower, except in our relationship between Britain and the United States, which had its historical origin in the cooperation during World War II. I don't know a case of a superpower making available nuclear technology for weapons purposes to another country.
No, that I wouldn't challenge that for a moment. What I mean is that when one talks about nuclear proliferation, well, perhaps proliferation is the wrong word. What I mean by it is other countries having nuclear weapons, even though they produce them themselves.
Yes, but
I think that, what has been happening really is everybody's been hoping this problem would go away.
But if you ask yourself, how are other countries going to develop nuclear weapons? They can do it in two ways. They can do it either like China, by developing the whole nuclear program on their own. This is one set of problems. That has happened only once, or maybe twice in China and in France. The second is that...
It could happen again.
It could happen again. The second is whether countries develop nuclear weapons on their own, but with the indirect assistance of the advanced nuclear countries in the form of peaceful nuclear technology. And both of these problems have to be dealt with. On the other hand, given the price of oil, and given the fact that it is a resource that will be depleted or substantially depleted in a foreseeable future, the spread of nuclear technology is very probable and will accelerate.
It's happened.
That is the basic dilemma, that as these nuclear reactors spread, how does one prevent the diversion of the product to terrorist use or to national use? This, incidentally, cannot be done by the United States and the Soviet Union alone. This is an area in which the European community, for example, or at least the European individual exporting countries have to participate on a level of total equality. It's not something that we in the Soviet Union can negotiate.
I had the impression that the alarm over the explosion of the nuclear device, so-called, in India, while it must have been extremely rewarding to the Indians, had very little world significance. And that if this is a pattern of the prospective proliferation, there's some danger that we have it slightly out of perspective. I'm constitutionally incapable of minimizing this sort of issue, but I do have a feeling that it was exaggerated in that case.
Well, I think there are two separate problems. One is, will the acquisition of nuclear weapons by developing countries change the balance between it and the superpowers? I think not, and in fact, I think it may enhance its inferiority, because it will take the case of a country, well, let's not mention countries, in case of any of the foreseeable developing countries, it will take at least a generation before they can create any plausible threat to a superpower, and would be totally destroyed unless they made themselves part of a nuclear alliance. This would, in fact, would be true even of the European forces. On the other hand, in their relations to each other and in the terrorist use of nuclear weapons, an enormous amount of damage can be done if materials can be diverted and then can be used by people who have demonstrated that they don't care about their own survival. And that can be done relatively easily.
Maybe I could interrupt again. There are three things I would like to hear discussed, and I'm here reacting to suggestions of my colleagues. First, how the former Premier of Thailand reacts to the slightly condescending tone with which we characteristically have been dealing with countries such as his. Admitting, I believe, that Thailand has no immediate intention of becoming a nuclear power. And I want to have a word from Arthur Schlesinger, who, not uncharacteristically, takes strong exceptions to the positions of both Kissinger and Arbatov.
I don't think it was a condescending sort of conversation at all. On the contrary, I thought it was a very cozy conversation between the superpowers. I felt completely out of it. Although I felt the coziness, I was very happy to hear it. But after listening to all that, I just can't help asking myself the question is, what are people like us to do? Have any kind of contribution? Or is it just arranged between the United States and the Soviet Russia that they wouldn't throw nuclear bombs at each other or at other people? And could I really believe that? No. That one day they might not change their mind. And I think we should pay more attention to nuclear proliferation, whatever that means. There seems to be a difference of opinion on that. But I'm not happy at all about the fact that so many of the developing countries are now hoping to get a nuclear reactor, nuclear plant for energy, because of the cost of oil and perhaps in some countries the running out of energy resource like water. That's all it's just a question that comes up to my mind. My country will never become a nuclear power. We are too careless people. We might really drop it somewhere.
Why do we laugh?
Well, Henry, can you reassure my old friend that you will be equally uncareless, as well as on the question he asked about proliferation?
Well, I think on the level of strategic arms, it has to be arranged between the nuclear superpowers, because they're the ones that have the capability of annihilating humanity. And I believe that the arrangement, as long as it doesn't lead to a political condominium, is in the interest of all of mankind, because a nuclear war between the superpowers would have physical consequences everywhere, not just indirect ones. How one can associate other countries with that process is important, but I don't think that the non-nuclear countries need necessarily be associated with the negotiation of the SALT agreement unless they're part of an alliance system that is affected by it. On the question of accident, I agree with Ted that there are many levels.
You are concerned about the dangers of accident and the possibilities of safeguard.
Let me make one other point about accident. If there is a danger of accident, or as the danger of accident increases, it must lead inevitably to precautions by countries that might be drawn in, that they will not be drawn into a nuclear war against their will. And you already see agreements between the Soviet Union and the United States, and between the Soviet Union and France, by which they can inform each other about accidental nuclear explosions so that they are not triggered into a catastrophe by the actions of others, so that the spread of nuclear weapons may have the paradoxical consequence of drawing those who have the greatest risk of being involved into a closer cooperation than would otherwise be the case.
Yes, I wanted to add that, I wanted to refer that we have some agreements on accidental, to prevent accidental, non-authorized launching of nuclear weapons. I am not in a position to judge, to evaluate whether it's enough or we need some more provisions for this. This must be always cared upon by the governments. But in general, I wouldn't say that our position is such that the steps that already were taken in Soviet-American relations, or the negotiations which are underway now, take away the whole danger of nuclear war. This is a very complicated task, and there must be a lot of work done to ensure it really with all guarantees, because here you cannot have 99% guarantee. It must be over 100 to really to make it sane and safe. And I might remind you that one of the reasons of deterioration of our relations with Chinese was our refusal to help them in acquiring nuclear capability. And so we don't do it with allies, we don't do it with other countries, and we, I'm sure, will be very positive on it in any international agreements and organizations which can be built up for it. I think nobody can complain about our allies, that they do it.
But can one be sure that as we are trying to reach international agreements against terrorism, the Soviet Union will be on the side of those who actively sponsor such agreements?
We are against terrorism. We are against terrorism, and this we have declared many times. But it will depend on the proposed agreement, because the concern is that can it include some, will be too broad and will include not only terrorists as such, but will also be directed against some parts of liberation
Can I ask a little question?
Yeah, sure.
And a big one.
I'm going to come to you, Shirley, and then to Arthur Schweitzer.
May I just ask a question?
Waiting for Arthur.
When I was in China last year, they were positive, they were quite sure that there will be a nuclear war between the superpowers. And they're making all kinds of preparations for it, practical preparations. Who's going to convince them that that is all as cozy as we have arranged? As I could judge from their remarks and their statements and conversation, they were absolutely sure that that war will happen in the near future.
I accept that, Kukrit, as a rhetorical question because I would think that on one point, there'd be one point of agreement that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union will be able to reassure the Chinese on that particular point.
Especially if they needed this word danger, scare of war for their internal purposes, you know. You cannot reassure them. Tunnels and things and very comfortably furnished underground.
Well, this seems to me they are...
Have you seen that?
I haven't availed myself of the opportunity, but they seem to be more convinced that one superpower may attack them than concerned that the two superpowers may cooperate with each other, although they have both concerns.
Well, what they said to me was that the two superpowers will fight each other in their country.
In China?
Very interesting scenario, yes.
Well, I must get to Shirley Williams.
I only wanted to make 2 points, and perhaps before Arthur says him to speak, because he can take them into account, really. One is conscious that we live literally from month to month, being mildly surprised if something like the Lebanon happens and the two sides don't get involved, or if something like Angola happens and at the right moment the United States decides not to take the matter any further. And therefore, what I really want to throw into the pot and bring you back to is how you deal with this chaotic political situation in which the rest of the actors insist upon being on the stage, and how you relate this to what seemed to me to be an extraordinary kind of controlled calmness that you feel about the nuclear situation, because it's very hard to see how you can keep the two apart for very much longer. In fact, they insist upon being brought together.
Can I respond to this before Arthur
This leads actually into the point I would like to make.
I was afraid you'd shake me so much that I'd forget my reply to this.
Well, you go ahead and reply, but I will. No, I think I'll override even the Secretary of State, because Arthur has been so unnaturally silent this morning, as you would be the first to agree, Henry, that we must give him his moment. Well, my point is not a momentous one, but it really it's very much related to what Shirley Williams has been saying. And that is the one point of agreement which the two distinguished representatives of the superpowers seem to have was in the rejection of the notion of selective détente. At least I understood Mr. Arbatov to endorse Henry Kissinger's rejection of that idea. I find myself as an historian unable to conceive any other kind of détente except a selective détente. Now, there may be ambiguities between descriptive and prescriptive uses of the word détente, but it seems to me that essentially détente is an expression of the stabilization which has been brought about for other reasons on other grounds. And when that stabilization has reached a point, it is recognized, and we call it détente. Therefore, détente is possible in Europe, where the balance of forces and the exhaustion of efforts to upset that balance have reached a point where finally it could be formalized in one form or another. But where this antecedent stability does not exist, as in the Middle East, as in Africa, it seems to me that you cannot expect détente to operate in the same sense that it does in Europe. So when, Henry, you said you can't separate détente in Europe from détente in Africa, I'm not quite clear as what that means. I appeal to you, gentlemen. I add just one word on that, Henry. I agree with that. And aren't you the sort of the living example? Didn't you get out of Vietnam ultimately because of selective détente?
Well, it depends how you define détente. You cannot define détente as an end to history, that all turmoil ends, that there's no further change in the world. That would be an unpolitical and an unhistorical approach to the question of détente. In the Middle East, in Africa, in all areas where either a physical or political equilibrium has not been established, changes are going to go on. And I think the superpowers have a responsibility to put some limit on their intervention, because if they push it beyond a certain point, the other one will be drawn in, and then their political relationship is bound to worsen. This would be the kind of restraint that I have in mind. And with respect to non-proliferation, with respect to the nuclear problem, in the field of strategic weapons, it is true that I believe that this is essentially between the United States and the Soviet Union, with some contribution by the European nuclear powers. The difficulty is that the points we've agreed on tend to be overtaken by the speed with which technology spreads and develops.
You see, I think on the point on this is that leaving aside Britain and France, we're already beyond that point as far as China, India and Israel are concerned. And so when you say you can reach an agreement about it, I'm not at all clear that this is so at the moment. It may be that in a quarter of a century's time it'll be possible to reach agreement, because then people won't feel they're being put into a subordinate position by the two superpowers or by Europe. But I would have thought the chances of reaching agreement in the sort of context in which Henry is talking, to which Rafe has been talking and so on, is really fairly remote. But the point I'd like to come back to, which I really think is the immediate one, as I said at the beginning, is not Kay's worry about an accident. I would have thought that people who've got the nuclear really have got such a complicated chain of control that it really is difficult to have accident. I noticed that Henry set up very smartly when Shirley said that you were offhand about your things. I mean, I wouldn't...
On our basis, I don't think that's correct.
I wouldn't support that for a moment.
I won't pursue it now, but there's been lots of plutonium, certainly.
I think
but
that
not from military bases.
Well, let's not argue about this, but I think
lost of plutonium where it's been stored.
The general control of weapons, so that if somebody goes mad or runs amok or gets a brainstorm or something, I would have thought that the combination necessary for that ever to happen is so minute that the chance of that sort of accident is remote. Now, on the other hand, I think the chance of political misjudgment is very acute. And I don't really accept the business about overall data, because I don't think that's what Mr. Arbatov was saying. He said quite specifically there will be things from the Soviet side which the Americans won't like, and there may be things from the American side which the Soviets don't like. That's a perfectly fair statement. And that's where the danger of misjudgment is. Now, I don't want to go back over Angola, but my view of Angola is that the Soviets made a specific judgment that the action they took would not bring an American response. Very well. They were right, because they made in the circumstances of presidential election year and the revulsion of Congress against ventures abroad like Vietnam and so on. Now, this is where the danger of misjudgment comes, and it is misjudgment which is on Europe's doorstep. One can see in Europe today a position where the Soviet Union would believe that it could take action without American reaction, and there might very well be an American reaction. And, I mean, one says to oneself, well, would the Soviet Union today take the same action which it took in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary in 56 and Czechoslovakia in 68? Would the Soviet Union do that again? And this is a very crucial point, because there is obviously a place in Europe where the Soviet Union would try to re-establish a position.
Yugoslavia.
Yes, and if you want to be specific. And what is going to be the consequence of that happening? Now, these are really the practical dangers which face us at this moment. And I'm not so worried about some soldier or sailor running amok, but I am worried about a misjudgment of that kind between the powers.
Well, it will be clear to everybody. About probable other situation, I could say that what was happened in Czechoslovakia was not a doctrine contrary to what was written in the Western press. It was an exceptional case of exceptional action which was taken in an extreme situation. It is not a model of Soviet behavior. We had many disagreements with some other allies of ours. We never did it. And this was an exceptional case, and you cannot build scenarios in this way.
Do you have any further comment, Henry, before I go on I think I will finish with Jack Jones. We've had, as I said this morning, a sense of urgency, a sense of agreement on the urgency that should not be without some measure of encouragement. So, Jack Jones.
Well, I think the most pleasing thing for me this weekend has been to be present at this discussion and to listen to what has been said and to have seen, to witness the exchange which has taken place, and if it's going to be televised, I think it can be enormously reassuring to the sort of people I represent. That doesn't mean to say that we wouldn't continue to be worried, but the fact that discussions are proceeding, that there could be this open exchange of the kind that has taken place, I think is encouraging. Of course, people generally, and working people in particular, are worried about the enormous cost of nuclear weaponry, and on one hand, we think in terms of the very considerable improvement in standards of living that could be affected if this cost was reduced or eliminated. That's an aspect that is always with us. And the other, of course, is the absolutely horrific consequences if this thing went wrong. And I think all of us recognize that it really is in the hands. We'd like to make reservations, such as Ted has made and others have made, about the requirements of other countries, but clearly the solution is in the hands of the two superpowers. It depends upon what America and the Soviet Union are prepared to do, how far they can go. And I think our main role, and the role of trade unionists all over the world, must be to pressurize the politicians into seeing the urgency and taking action towards solutions. Otherwise, we'll have to do something ourselves. And perhaps one of the things we should certainly do is to talk more between the working people of all our countries. I frankly believe that it would be possible to get some talks proceeding between the trade unions of Israel and some of the Arab countries. We've encouraged that to a limited degree, but we could do with, when I say we, I mean the British trade union movement, we could do with assistance from other trade union movements, perhaps larger than ours, in that direction. We've got to forget a lot of the past attitudes and be prepared to take some initiatives on behalf of the people we represent, who in the final analysis, of course, are the people who suffer if we do go into a nuclear war situation.
The discussions were over. It was discussion and not argument, and you will have sensed the shared feeling of urgency. I would be happy as I end this series if some of the same sense of urgency on this problem, and maybe others, remained with you, my long-suffering audience, and I hope I can still say, my friends.